are rising across the globe, sending the cost of living soaring. So why is this happening, and what does it mean for you?
The war in Ukraine seems a long way away from this beach in South Shields, but the soaring price of potatoes, fish, oil, the energy to cook them is in part due to that conflict. It's causing a cost of living and a cost of doing business emergency.
But it's not just about food. Tourism, which is a lifeline to the Egyptian economy, is likely to be hit hard too. Around 40% of tourists who visit Egyptian sea resorts come from Russia and Ukraine.
Before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Zimbabwe was already battling a double-digit inflation, and these price increases are likely to worsen the economic outlook.
The surge in energy prices and inflation, a global phenomenon affecting the entire world.
Business on the BBC. Make the connection.
Let us be your inside guide to a world of travel.
And hopefully give you some inspiration for when you hit the road again.
That's The Travel Show on BBC World News.
I'm Laura Trevelyan in Washington, and this is BBC World News America. The international effort to get grain out of Ukraine's ports has begun. Ukraine is preparing to export grain again from Black Sea ports blockaded by Russia. Turkey opens a headquarters to oversee operations. The Federal Reserve hikes US interest rates for the fourth time this year as it tries to bring down historically high inflation. The impact of that inflation hits hamburgers. In the UK, McDonalds is one of the big brands putting up the prices because of soaring costs. Homes reduced to ashes by California's largest wildfire this year. We hear from families who've lost everything. Welcome to World News America on PBS in the United Kingdom and around the globe. We begin tonight with the effort to restart blockaded grain exports from Ukraine and prevent a global food crisis. In Turkey, a coordination centre has begun work as part of a complex deal to get grain out of Ukrainian ports. The aim is to export 5 million tonnes of grain a month. That was the figure before Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Our correspondent Richard Galpin reports.
From the start of the war back in February, Russian forces have been blockading Ukraine's Black Sea ports, preventing the exports of Ukrainian wheat and other grains vital for the food supplies of many countries around the world. According to officials, there are around 20 million tons of grain in Ukraine. With fears growing of global food shortages, it seems there may now have been a breakthrough with a deal agreed by the two sides. It's hoped it will be possible for ships to be inspected near Turkey and then guided past Ukrainian sea mines before being loaded with grains and fertilizer. The first shipments are due in the coming days. All this after Turkey's defence minister, Hulusi Akar, unveiled a coordination centre in Istanbul to oversee the export of Ukrainian grains.
Currently, the preparation and planning is continuing for the ships laden with grain that will leave Ukrainian ports. The work done by Joint Coordination Centre will contribute to overcoming the food crisis affecting the whole world.
The UN, Ukraine and Russia have all said they expect exports to begin in a few days. But Russia's Deputy Foreign Minister Andrei Rudenko has warned the deal could collapse if obstacles to Russia's agricultural exports are not promptly removed. Richard Galpin, BBC News.
Meanwhile, Ukrainian rocket strikes have forced Russia to shut an important bridge, which is a crucial supply line for Russian forces. The Antonovsky Bridge connects the occupied city of Kherson to the east bank of the Dnipro River. Our diplomatic correspondent Paul Adams explains.
This was late last night, a pretty substantial barrage of precision rockets launched by this newly acquired system, the HIMARS system, which the Americans have supplied to the Ukrainians. It gives them the ability to launch precision strikes at some distance, and they've been using it to try and destroy the bridges that connect Kherson and the region around Kherson to other Russian-controlled territory on the other side of the Dnipro River. And finally, last night, they effectively succeeded in making sure that the bridge, the main Antonovsky Bridge, is no longer usable. And judging by the images that we've seen of it, it's going to take quite a long time to repair it. It's not the only bridge. There's also a railway bridge and another bridge on the nearby tributary, both of which have also been targeted by the Ukrainians. And this is all part, Western officials say, of a growing Ukrainian counteroffensive designed ultimately to retake Kherson, a city that was taken very early on in the war by the Russians, the first city of any consequence to be taken, regarded, Western officials say, as the jewel in the crown of Russia's occupation of southern Ukraine. So obviously if Ukraine could retake it, that would be a huge setback for Russia.
Paul Adams reporting there. Well, as the war grinds on, European gas prices have soared by almost 2%, close to the record high set after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. It comes a day after countries in the European Union agreed to reduce their gas use by 15% between August and March. That's in response to Russia slashing its supply to the continent. The US Federal Reserve has raised interest rates by 0.75 percentage point, the fourth rate rise this year and the second big monthly hike in a row, as the central bank tries to bring down inflation, which is at a 40-year high. The chairman of the Fed, Jerome Powell, said he didn't believe the US was currently in recession, despite the slowing economy, but he added the path to avoiding a recession is narrowing.
Today's increase is in the target range is the second 75 basis point increase in as many meetings. While another unusually large increase could be appropriate at our next meeting, that is a decision that will depend on the data we get between now and then.
Well, inflation is at a 40-year high in the UK too, where big-name brands including McDonalds, Coca-Cola and Unilever are putting up prices in response. McDonald's has raised the price of cheeseburgers for the first time in 14 years as companies grapple with the impact of higher costs. Here's our consumer affairs correspondent, Coletta Smith.
Big names are putting prices up. Over recent weeks, we've heard from huge household brands saying they're charging us more. Today it was McDonald's turn.
Right, what can I get for you?
Can I just get a cheeseburger, please? They announced they've added between 10 and 20 pence to lots of items on the menu. All right, take care. My cheeseburger has gone up from 99 pence to £1.19. McDonald's say they're facing increased costs for things like fuel, wages and ingredients. When the likes of McDonald's and other big brands start increasing the price on key products that everyone knows the price for, that's when as customers we really start to feel the difference. And it shows that what's happening behind the scenes is that even the world's biggest companies can't absorb the amount of price increases that they're facing at the moment, so they're passing it straight on to us. But with prices rising so quickly on bills and household basics, it's those with the least who are struggling the most. Hi Jodine, how are you? Jodine has 4 children and is dependent on her universal credit payments.
Trying my hardest, that's all I can do. That's what anyone can do, is just try the hardest, but it's like our hardest is just not enough.
With prices for food, groceries and energy bills set to rise much higher in the months ahead, Jodine and millions like her are hoping for help, but bracing themselves for the worst. Coletta Smith, BBC News.
In the UK, the knock-on effects from today's rail strike are expected to disrupt services into Thursday. More than 40,000 rail workers from the RMT union and 14 train operators walked out on Wednesday, reducing services in some parts of the UK to 20% of the usual schedule. The unions say talks over jobs and pay haven't progressed in recent weeks, while the government called the action completely unnecessary. Now, a possible trip to Taiwan by the Speaker of the US House of Representatives, Nancy Pelosi, is raising tensions still further between Beijing and Washington. China regards Taiwan as its territory, even though Taiwan sees itself as an independent country with its own constitution and democratically elected leaders. A spokesperson for China's foreign ministry says if the visit goes ahead, China will resolutely respond with countermeasures. For more, I spoke to the former Prime Minister of Australia, Kevin Rudd, who's now president of the Asia Society. Mr. Rudd, China is warning of a firm and absolute response if Speaker Pelosi goes to Taiwan, saying that the US will be responsible for all of the serious consequences. What does that mean? Does that sound like a potential military response by Beijing?
I look carefully at the statements both by the Foreign Ministry, but more importantly by the spokesman for the Chinese Ministry of Defence. If you look at the text of that, these are unusual statements in terms of being forthright. I think it's quite conceivable there will be a form of military response, but we should not necessarily restrict that to in theatre, that is directly relevant to the Speaker's proposed visit. It could be reflected elsewhere. But this is speculation, but I note that this language is unusually sharp.
Now, when President Biden speaks to President Xi, they're due to speak by phone on Thursday. Do you expect that this situation could be de-escalated somehow?
Well, my own view is that Speaker Pelosi should not go. And the reason is I don't see her visit as actually enhancing Taiwan's interests. Most of us who are friends of Taiwan want to see the long-term preservation of the Taiwan status quo. And that's going to be achieved by a bunch of other measures from the United States, its partners, friends and allies, and the Taiwanese itself, including Taiwan's indigenous defense. Bringing on a crisis early by what is essentially a symbolic visit, I don't think helps. So hopefully by the time these two leaders speak, the matter is resolved. But if it's not, then it will inevitably be a focus of this summit. This is only the third virtual summit that these two leaders have had since President Biden took office. It would be, I think, unfortunate if it was derailed by this symbolic visit by the United States Speaker.
But has the US got itself into a muddle now, whereby if Speaker Pelosi doesn't go to Taiwan, the US looks weak?
Well, to be fair to the US administration, I think they're signalling on their overall China strategy under Secretary of State Blinken, under National Security Advisor Sullivan, but also under President Biden, has been fairly straight and forthright now for 18 months. I think this is some free-ranging by Speaker Pelosi. Does it have a reputational impact in the United States? Of course it does. But beneath the surface, we all know the administration is desperately trying to talk Speaker Pelosi out of it. And as a friend and partner of the United States, but now heading a think tank, I would also urge Speaker Pelosi simply to postpone the visit, send some other congressional representatives at this stage. There's so many tinderboxes in the world at the moment. Why unnecessarily add an additional tinderbox when we've got so much else we're wrestling with?
Kevin Rudd, thank you. The US Secretary of State Antony Blinken says the US has offered a substantial deal to Russia aimed at freeing the American detainees Brittany Griner and Paul Whelan. Mr. Blinken says he expects to speak with Russia soon about the proposal. Let's get more with our State Department correspondent, Barbara Plett-Usher. Barbara, is some kind of a prisoner swap in the works?
Well, we don't know that, Laura, because he wouldn't give any details about this substantial proposal. What we do know is that there was a prisoner swap with Russia a couple of months ago that the administration negotiated. We also know that Russia has expressed interest in the release of a notorious arms dealer who's in jail in the United States. And we know that there's been mounting pressure on the administration to win the release of Brittany Griner, who's a famous basketball star who was arrested on drug-related charges in Russia, and Paul Whelan, who's a former U.S. Marine who's been detained there for several years, and that the administration officials have said repeatedly that they are determined to do so. But still, this is quite a rare and risky move to go public at this juncture, especially because the administration hasn't been speaking to the Russians since the invasion of Ukraine.
Barbara, with that analysis, thank you. Now, the White House says President Biden has tested negative for COVID-19 after spending 5 days in isolation. The president will continue to wear a mask for the next 10 days. Here's Mr. Biden speaking at the White House a little bit earlier on Wednesday.
Here's the bottom line. When my predecessor got COVID, he had to get helicoptered to Walter Reed Medical Center. He was severely ill. Thankfully, he recovered. When I got COVID, I worked from upstairs of the White House, and the office is upstairs, and for that 5-day period. The difference is vaccinations, of course.
Now, US media outlets are reporting that the Department of Justice is investigating former President Donald Trump's actions in the days before the January 6th attack on the US Capitol. That's reportedly part of a wider criminal probe into efforts to overturn the 2020 election result. For more, let's bring in Ron Christie, a Republican strategist who worked in the White House of President George W. Bush and also a lawyer. Ron, do you think President Trump could be in some legal bother here?
Good evening to you, Laura. Anytime that you are under investigation by the Federal Department of Justice, yes, I think you could potentially be in some legal jeopardy. The question is, what crimes are they looking to potentially indict him on, and when will they bring said charges if they elect to do so?
But Ron, the question is whether or not the president's in legal trouble ultimately. Is he in some political trouble? When you look at, for example, the governor of Florida, Ron DeSantis, he seems to be polling pretty well against Mr. Trump in a potential matchup for who gets the Republican nomination.
There's no question in my mind, Laura, that Ron DeSantis is gaining on the president. You've seen some polls indicate that New Hampshire, the first state where we vote here in the United States, that he's overtaken Mr. Trump in a potential head-on-head matchup. So, yes, I think the potential legal liabilities here are diminishing President Trump's star a little bit.
And we're hearing that President Trump's one-time chief of staff, Mick Mulvaney, who actually resigned as a Northern Ireland envoy in disgust on January the 6th, that he's speaking to the committee investigating January 6th tomorrow. How do you assess the significance of that, Ron?
Well, I can tell you the White House chief of staff is probably the second most powerful person in the White House. It's not the vice president. The chief of staff not only manages the staff, but they manage the president. So Mick Mulvaney will be in a position to share with the committee what was the president doing, what was the president not doing, and shed more light on what it was like in those fearful hours while this insurrection was going on.
Ron Christie, thank you. Well, a US congressional committee investigating the arms industry says gun manufacturers earned more than $1 billion from the sale of semi-automatic weapons over the last decade. Some lawmakers accuse gun makers of putting profits over people as committee members grilled the CEOs of weapons manufacturers following a series of grim mass shootings in Texas and New York. This comes a month after President Biden signed a bipartisan gun reform bill into law, but House Democrats want to go even further and ban assault weapons. In other news now from around the world, at least 4 people have died in the Philippines after a 7.0 magnitude earthquake struck the northern province of Abra. Almost 60 landslides have been reported and many buildings and roads have been damaged. A historical World Heritage site has also been partly destroyed. The quake was felt as far away as 180 miles in the country's capital, Manila. French President Emmanuel Macron has strongly criticised the response of African leaders to the war in Ukraine. Mr. Macron is currently in Cameroon in the middle of a tour of the continent. He spoke about what he called the hypocrisy of some leaders denying the conflict in Ukraine was a war. The United Nations has criticised China's crackdown on political activists in Hong Kong, saying Beijing's imposition of a national security law in 2020 appears to override fundamental rights guaranteed when the territory was handed over from the UK 25 years ago. The UN's Human Rights Committee said the national security law should be repealed. Firefighters in California are battling wildfires that have forced thousands of people to evacuate. Oak Fire started on Friday and has burned through almost 20,000 acres in the Mariposa County. Only about a quarter of the fire is under control. Our correspondent James Clayton has joined one family returning to their property for the first time since their home was burned down. A warning, his report contains scenes that some viewers may find upsetting.
This was the Martinez family's favourite place in the world. They called it Shangri-La. Their home has now been obliterated. Aaron has returned to assess the damage.
This is my house. This is where I felt the safest. This is where my office was, my television, my computer, books and binders. There's just nothing. It's a picture frame. It has a glass frame. Had family pictures in it. It's all the stuff that can't be replaced. It hurts. Grandmother's writing. Pictures. Oh God. Even the old answering machines that we saved, that we stopped using just so we could hear grandparents' voices. It's all gone.
Aaron's wife Heather is trying to look for the family cats.
I don't see anything.
Yeah, I'm trying to hear more than see.
They had 15 of them, but none of them respond to the calls.
Looks like it was one of the teenage ones, or the teenage to adult. Poor thing.
Her son Austin finds one of the kittens. It didn't make it.
I've never experienced anything like this ever in my life, ever.
The grief is overwhelming for Aaron, but the family knew living here was becoming increasingly risky.
The climate here, you've lived here all your life. Have you noticed it change?
It has gotten a lot hotter and a lot drier. A lot of people we've talked to were like, should we try to rebuild? Should we stay? And they say, we're selling. We're getting out of here.
The Martinez family didn't have insurance. They didn't just lose memory.
We're going to rebuild.
What happened to the Martinez family is a danger more and more Californians are facing as it gets drier and drier. James Clayton, BBC News, California.
So much loss in California from those wildfires. Well, it's almost a year since the Taliban retook power in Afghanistan, and resistance forces loyal to the previous government are fighting an insurgency. At the moment, clashes are confined to a handful of areas long known for anti-Taliban sentiment. But resistance forces are behind the most sustained clashes Afghanistan has seen over the past year. Secunda Kamani was given rare access to an area where anti-Taliban forces have been active, the Andarab Valley.
Out on patrol, the Taliban are now more powerful than they've ever been, more powerful than the old Afghan government ever was. But in this scenic part of the country, they're facing a resistance movement. A small band of guerrillas, led by former army soldiers, is launching attacks here in Andarab, as well as in neighbouring Panjshir province, where they recently managed to bring down a Taliban helicopter. It's hard to get a sense of the true scale of the fighting. The resistance exaggerate their strength, whilst the Taliban outright deny their presence.
You can see yourself, we only have a small military presence here. There are no problems.
I was told of at least one ambush on a Taliban vehicle in this valley.
That was a long time ago. We carried out some operations in the mountains, and now there is nothing.
Elsewhere in this province, resistance fighters managed to take over a Taliban military post, pulling down their flag. But when we visit Andarab, they're the ones in charge. From what we've seen, the Taliban are in firm control of the territory here. That's presumably why they're happy for us to have visited. But they're also accused of committing serious human abuses and trying to stamp out this resistance movement. It's told us villagers Abdul Hashim were detained and killed after wrongly attacking the Taliban.
As for people of their homes, detained, bound, and killed, we totally refuse this. Yes, in an area, and someone violently, the government forces, they will be killed or everywhere in the world.
Taliban fighters at all times. It was hard to gauge what locals really think. Many we contacted secretly strongly opposed the Taliban, but some also criticised the resistance forces. We managed to speak to one of their commanders. Surely there's no actual chance of you defeating the Taliban, so what's the point in continuing the violence?
Our fight is for justice,
for brotherhood, equality, and for the real Islam, not the Islam of the Taliban, which defames the religion. Our fight is for the rights of our sisters. The Prophet Muhammad said education is compulsory for both men and women.
The Taliban's insurgency over the past 2 decades was in part fueled by anger at aggressive raids and the killing of civilians by international forces and the Afghan army. Here in Andarab and the surrounding areas, despite recruiting some locals, many see the Taliban as outsiders, and they risk repeating the same mistakes as their old opponents. Sikandar Kamani, BBC News, Andarab.
In football, Germany have beaten France in the second semi-finals match of the Women's Euros. Both teams got a goal before half-time, but Germany took the lead in the second half to win 2-1. The 8-time European champions will now face England in Sunday's final at Wembley Stadium in London. And finally tonight, a new statue has been unveiled here in Washington in the US Capitol's Statuary Hall. It's a tribute to Amelia Earhart to mark the 90th anniversary of her solo flight across the Atlantic. Earhart's statue brings the total number of women in the hall to just 11 out of 100 statues. I'm Laura Trevelyan. Thank you so much for watching BBC World News America.
Hello there. It's cooled down a bit across much